Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Conversations on Conversations, where each week we explore a topic to help us have more powerful conversations with ourselves and others. I'm your host, Sarah Noll Wilson, and joining me today is my colleague and friend, Jami Haberl, as we discuss the topic of mental health. So let me tell you a little bit about Jami to get you set up. For the last 10 years, Jami Haberl has been the executive director at the Iowa Healthiest State Initiative. Her dedication to health and wellness blossomed at the age of 10, prompted by a pivotal event when her youngest sister fell into a coma at just 1 year old. This profound experience catalyzed her lifelong commitment to understanding the interplay between controllable and uncontrollable factors affecting health. Recognizing the critical role of health in enabling individuals to lead vibrant and purposeful lives, she embarked on a journey to champion well-being. Her career has included working on state and national initiatives in the field of telemedicine, healthcare reimbursement, bioterrorism, disaster management, and public-private partnerships. A native of Loreville, Iowa, Jami received her undergraduate degree in community health education from Iowa State University, a master's in public health, and a master's in healthcare administration from Des Moines University. Jami and her husband, James Peterson, live in Des Moines and enjoy scuba diving, biking, hiking, and traveling the world. Please enjoy this conversation I was privileged to record with Jami. Jami Haberl, welcome to the show.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited. It took us a bit to get to this point, and you're here and we're doing this. So Jami, other than what we've shared in your bio, what else do you want people to know about you?
Well, I am a native Iowan. And I think one thing I grew up in rural Iowa, town of 300, oldest of 5 kids. But I've lived in the Des Moines area for, over 20 years. Kind of hard to believe and to say that out loud, right? And I'm just really passionate about a lot of work in the area of prevention, like looking at things that we can control versus things that we can't control, whether it comes to previous work that I've done in disasters or my current work of working in the health and well-being space.
Yeah, so
and
talk
I love
to us.
Scuba dive.
Okay, where's like the coolest place you got to scuba dive?
Oh gosh.
Or what's one of your favorite?
One of my favorites is the Maldives. Definitely was one of my favorite. And Palau is impressive in and of itself. The underwater landscape is unbelievable.
What do you like? I've never been. So what do you like about it? I'm so curious.
So I think what's interesting for me is I actually don't know how to swim, but I've been scuba. I know.
Okay, this makes me feel like this is a possibility for me because I can swim, but I can't swim great. Okay, wait. Yeah, continue.
So I could probably doggy paddle and survive, but I don't know how to I couldn't swim laps or anything by any means. So I think part of it that it pushed me outside of my comfort zone. And it is the one place that it feels like I'm just meditating and I'm hanging out with this beautiful marine life that isn't talking back to you or saying things negative, right? It's a very peaceful place to be. And the ocean is such a critical component of the earth and our environment. And so it just provides a great place for me to shut my brain off because my brain struggles to shut off a lot of times.
Yeah, I understand. And I feel that intimately. Thanks for talking about that. I want to see pictures afterwards. Okay. But Jami, I don't know. You and I've known each other. We got connected through our mutual colleague, Kristen Souter, a number of years ago. But I realized in preparing for this conversation, although our paths cross online and in person, I don't know your journey to this place. So what was your evolution to moving into this work and this role that you're so passionate about? And I just want to say this. We have listeners all over the globe. So while there might be things that you're speaking to specific to the work you're doing in the state of Iowa, the United States, there's a lot of great resources on their site that is available to anyone who would benefit from it. So I just want to level set that. So yeah, what was your journey to this work?
So it really takes me back all the way to the age of 10. So I share that I'm the oldest of 5. My youngest sibling, who is 10 years younger than me, she actually has lived with a chronic genetic disease since the day she was born. We didn't know that when she was born, but at the age of about 18 months old, she went into a coma. And so as you can imagine, a 10-year-old, right, who their youngest sibling goes into a coma. We're not really sure what's going on. And the journey that she has taken throughout her entire life has really been one of trying to figure out, what was causing this coma? What was the diagnosis? She was diagnosed with a very rare metabolic disorder. She was one of 100 in the world that was known to have this disorder. Wow. And so throughout her course of her life, I've been able to, I guess, experience or endure what it's like for someone to live with a health condition, one that she was born with and really had no control over, and how it's really impacted her life. She's now, 35 years old, but she's disabled. She, probably functions more of at someone who is probably 9 or 10 years old. And so you just see how health really drives one's ability to live their fullest life, and how that could have been very different, obviously, if she wasn't born with this metabolic disorder by any means. But it really provided me, I guess, an opportunity to walk into what health really means at such a young age.
Yeah.
And so that was, I would say, is what started my journey in this. And originally I had planned and wanted to be a physician, but throughout college and throughout even high school, I worked as a certified nursing assistant and did home health care and hospice work. And I think got burnt out on direct care, to be honest with you. And I thought, how can we do this differently? Or how can I work in a space that allows more ability to look at kind of the community environments that drive our choices each and every day and ultimately drive our health outcomes, right? Yes, genetics plays a role in that, but a lot of it is outside of that. And so that really started my journey of doing public health and community health education early on in my career, and took me through an interesting route to get to where I am today, even.
Yeah. There's, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know any of that about your story. And also it was having a moment of thinking, man, doing hospice support when you're at any point, but especially when you're younger, how did that experience shape you? Did you say you were in high school, college when you were doing that work?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I was going into 6th grade, I'm the oldest grandchild on my mom's side of the family and really close to my mom's side of the family. And my grandmother at the time had asked if I would watch my great grandmother hang out with her overnight because they were going to a wedding out of town. And she hadn't been feeling well. And my great grandma probably at the time was, I'm guessing, in her 80s, close to 90s, right? And so she actually passed away when I was caring for her that night. So I think I've reflected a lot on that, especially recently, because my grandmother is actually in hospice today. Yeah. And I think she still carries a lot of burden of like, oh my gosh, I sent my granddaughter in there and then her mother died. But I think I was telling my mom even just the other day, I think it has given me a different perspective about health and about life and about death, to be honest with you, that I don't know that I could ever have experienced outside of having to experience that moment of losing my great grandmother, because that I think was the start of me wanting to do direct patient care, going into even doing hospice work and having a different kind of lens and appreciation for what the end of life can be like for some people. Unfortunately, we don't have that perspective always in our society, right? We want people to live forever and ever, regardless of what their quality of life is. And so it's really given me, as I've gotten older and thought about just my own journey, right? It's like, it has provided a type of experience that I don't think I could have ever created on its own. Yeah. And I think has really given me the opportunity to have empathy and to understand really the value of health and how it can impact one's life, whether it's today or in the future.
There's a lot to unpack with that. And it also, knowing you the way that I do, getting to observe you in the work and how you show up with your passion, I feel like I'm having this moment of that makes even more sense now. So I appreciate that. The other thing that I want to go back to for a moment, when you were talking about the experience with your sister and navigating all of that, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it, is that idea of experiencing versus enduring. And I'm curious to tease that out a bit, because when we think about experiences with our health system, with our mental health system. Sometimes it's a good experience and sometimes you're just enduring it. And I'm curious, how does that shape you? Or even maybe the question that should be asked is, how do we even take that into consideration of, am I creating something that's a good experience, or am I creating something that is an endurance for somebody?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because the experience of healthcare, I would say, has definitely evolved even the time over, as I think about the many times, that I would sit at the University of Iowa's Children's Hospital with my sister who was in the hospital, and watching my mom experience and navigate a system that she knew nothing about. I mean,
Yeah.
I consider her an expert when it comes to insurance and health systems now, because she's had to do it for so long, in all honesty. And I think part of it is you have to either figure it out on your own, right? And you have to be an advocate. And that's the hardest role, and I think the most important role that my mom has definitely played for my sister, and even for us siblings, to really, you got to push forward and try and make the most of what resources you have available at that time, even though it can be extremely challenging and extremely difficult.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, let's spend some time. Let's talk about mental health. And for people who are listening to it, I'm wearing my Make It Okay shirt. That is part of your campaign. And when this episode airs, so just for folks listening, I believe in honesty, we're recording in April, and this will air sometime in May during Mental Health Awareness Month. Jami, something that I keep hearing some people say, particularly in our work, is the pandemic is over. I don't understand why people aren't just, quote unquote, going back to normal. Please respond.
Oh, if it was so easy, right? So I think what's been interesting with the mental health journey, as I think about it, even is, so before the pandemic hit, or as the pandemic was hitting, so my work prior to entering the Iowa Healthiest State Initiative was working in disasters. But those type of disasters primarily were very demographic specific, right? So they might hit a community. And one of the lagging challenges of any natural disaster is mental health. And so when early on when the pandemic started, it was like, mental health is going to be the biggest challenge that comes out of this event that we're living in, right? And we really didn't know what we were living in at that moment in 2020. And so, I kept saying, we've got to really focus on our Make It Okay work. We've got to be talking about mental health, because not only are we going to see an impact immediately following or during this disaster, we're going to see for years, this mental health is going to continue to be a challenge. And it's really going to relate back to the disaster that we all lived through in 2020 and plus, right? And so it's not something, mental health doesn't just magically fix itself, right? And I think it's foolish for any of us to think, well, we're out of the pandemic, right? So it should just all go away and everyone should just be back to where we were in, December of 2019. That's not going to happen. We've all lived through some pretty significant trauma, and some of us the trauma has been much deeper than others, but every single human on this earth has experienced some form of trauma because of living through a worldwide pandemic. And so it's not just going to go away. It's not going to go back to what it was in 2019 and before. Like, we have to figure out what this looks like going forward, and how do we put the systems in place? How do we put the resources in place to support the trauma and the mental health impact that this pandemic has caused on this generation and generations to come, in all honesty.
It's interesting to hear you use that language of disaster, because I'm realizing while we all felt it was a disaster, I don't know that people talked about it like that, and they still don't. And you mentioned that lagging, right? That mental health challenge of lagging. What are you seeing in your work, or what are you seeing in the research that you all follow? Because I know what we're observing are things like we see that resilience feels lower for a lot of people. Burnout feels higher in a way that maybe it didn't before. So I'm curious just to what are you seeing? What are you all talking about, or what are you hearing from the front lines of research around how is this manifesting? And I know that's a loaded question, because how it's manifesting for some people is different than, for example, I have young nibblings who were like 1 and 3 during the pandemic, and how it's manifesting for them looks very, very different now than how it's maybe showing up for you and I.
Yeah. So I would say we're seeing a lot of the same things you just mentioned, right? I think burnout in multiple areas of the workforce is at an all-time high, right? So I think part of that is because when you're dealing with a pandemic type of disaster versus a tornado or a flood, for example, it's kind of like there is this feeling where you move into recovery.
Yeah.
Whereas with a pandemic, I don't know that we've ever moved into recovery and we've really reflected on the impact of that disaster. And so I think that's having a much more challenge on our mental health than any of us. And I personally see that myself, to be honest with you. I think I've never took the moment to like, okay, let's decompress. We just went through this event, and it was a pandemic and not a flood, which I've experienced floods and tornadoes for a number of years in my previous work. And we always have this moment where it's like, okay, now we can say that we're done, we move on, we go through this recovery phase, and then it's over. Well, you can't do that with a pandemic. It's so different.
Yeah.
And so I think that burnout, why we're seeing it in other sectors outside of what I think we were seeing during the exact, pandemic disaster, like teachers and our healthcare system, is because none of our society, we just kept moving on. Yeah. And I think it's okay to move on, but you also have to have time to almost like grieve and step back and evaluate, like, holy smokes, what did we just go through? And how do we go forward better? Right. Yeah. And I don't think we've ever done that. And I think that's definitely causing some of the challenges for mental health across multiple age groups and sectors here as well. I think also the other thing that I've been seeing is we're kind of reverting back to some of the, I'm going to call toxic workplace cultures. Like those are coming back, and it's almost like we didn't learn from the time of the disaster of the pandemic. And so we're reverting back to some of these very negative culture aspects that I would hope we wouldn't revert back to. I think part of it is lack of empathy. Part of it is, like, why can't people just like figure this out? Kind of the same stigma that we would see around mental health conversations before the pandemic. And then we started to see those go down because, of course, everyone was struggling, to be honest with you. Whether we had a diagnosis or not was irrelevant. Yeah. We were all struggling. And now we're coming into this next phase, and it's like, okay, well, everyone should just, that's in the past. Let's move on. We got to catch up for the time that we lost. And that's not positive. And that's not a good direction for us to be going, in my opinion.
This is why I've been waiting to have you on the show. This is why I'm so excited. That point of when you go through something that is event-based, and there is this very clear recovery time. I've never thought about it, but sure as hell did have experienced it before. And I was reflecting as you were talking, there were some organizations that I feel actually did a really good job of, can we just talk about what the hell happened and what we did to navigate that? And how do we honor it? And how do we honor how it's shaped who we are? And how do we use that to inform where we're going and who we want to be? But to be real, that was one company. And so in the spirit of, one of the things we always try to do with this show is share specific strategies or questions or topics. What might it look like? And I'm curious to get your thoughts on a couple different ways. What would it look like as an individual to take time to move into more of that recovery reflection phase? What might it look like for a family or a team or an organization Or maybe you have examples of what that looks like done really well. I mean, something we've talked about is we should just do a whole separate podcast on what was your COVID experience? What did you lose? What became clear for you? What was really hard when you look back? Because there's stuff you look back now, you're like, holy shit, we went through some stuff, like I can't even look at some of my like photos from that time without still having a reaction of that. So yeah, what might it look like for us to take some time and reflect and go, what the hell happened?
Well, I think part of it is what you said. It's stepping back and pausing and giving the space to even reflect.
Yeah.
I think we're really good about just keep moving, right? And not really giving the space for us to stop and pause and ask the question, right? Like, what was lost? What worked out really well during that time, right? What was a positive during that time? What did you see that was different? But then having the ability to actually like, what was lost? What were the challenges? What were you frustrated with the most? And how can we reflect on those? And then how can you use those to do things differently going forward as well? And I would say personally, I've been doing a lot of that just recently because I have recognized myself like, oh man, I don't think I ever took the time to actually do this decompression, or as we often used to say in the disaster world, do an after action report. Okay. What worked well, what didn't work well. Right. And like, just even myself personally trying to really take the moment so that I can, it's like digest it all, recognize it, and then be able to move forward having recognized it. I think sometimes when we don't recognize it and we don't have the conversation, or we just want to not have the conversation and keep moving on, it just continues to almost stew within yourself. And that can lead to other physical or mental challenges going forward. And so it's like, we've got to be able to have these conversations and not just ignore what happened during that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's such a gift. And I don't normally do this, but listeners, people who are listening, if you want to share your COVID story with us, send us an email at podcast@sarahnollwilson.com, where myself and my team, and I'll share it with Jami, we will happily hold space. If you want to process this, or you can send us a voice note or whatever. I do think that is so important. The other thing that I'm curious to get your thoughts on is it's hard for us, it's hard for some folks to see how that chronic stress, that chronic experience, that trauma, that disaster, which I'm going to just use every time now, thank you, how that impacts how we're showing up. And there's two sort of ways of it, right? I was talking with a group, this was about 2 years ago, actually, a year and a half. And I was talking about this idea of PTSD and how a lot of us don't have a clear understanding of what PTSD is. And we think it's only specific to an event, or we think it's going to be very obvious that, oh, I'm having this reaction because this event happened, when we might not realize that maybe I'm shorter with my spouse or my family members because I'm just in sort of a chronic state of dysregulation. So what are, I don't want to say symptoms, but what are signs or what are or symptoms, right? What are some of those things that you are seeing or that the research is showing of how some of this mental health crisis, right? Kind of the post-crisis is showing up for folks.
Well, I definitely think some of that ties to, you can have physical symptoms, and we're seeing, even looking at some of the diseases that are continuing to challenge Americans that are really chronic health conditions, that I think stress can also add to that, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's autoimmune disorders that, we're seeing, or just obesity, diabetes, heart disease. I don't think we all appreciate, and I'll be even honest that I probably didn't give as much credit to what stress does on your body, both mentally and physically. But it's like this hidden thing that's just can really impact your long-term health and even your short-term health. And it's hard for us in a society to step back and recognize that, man, the stress level, like, how do I reduce it? Yeah. And so I think you start to see, increased anxiety. You see people maybe barking at people differently than they have, or not having the patience as well. And I think a lot of that is really driven by stress. And we are often in that flight stage, right? We're not really finding ways to deregulate. And I know there's a lot of conversation about self-care, and we talk about the importance of those, but are we really giving the space for people to actually do them, and to do them well? Not to just say, oh, I'm going to go do my meditation for 1 minute and I'm going to pretend like I'm doing it, but are you doing it?
Yeah.
So that it actually has an impact, and that it's really, deregulating your system and putting you back into kind of that equilibrium versus constant height of we're living in this state of awareness, of heightened awareness, that does not have a positive impact on us long term. I mean, some level of stress is okay, but not the level that we're seeing, I would say, in kids to adults.
Yeah.
And that's what's scary, is definitely within our kids, because that's going to have that impact on them scares me for the future.
Yeah. I want to come back to the kids for a second, and because that is an important conversation, and that idea of really prioritizing it and not realizing it. And again, we're speaking from an American capitalist hustle culture mindset, but we've been doing a lot more work on burnout with teams. And, so often it's, how do we help people navigate burnout? I'm like, we need to be talking about how to prevent it, because by the time somebody's crispy, by the time that you're already there, that's a bigger hill to come back from. And even that, we were just having a conversation this morning. So for listeners, Jami asked me how I was doing, and I was sharing that I'm exhausted today. I'm really tired. I was really, really tired. And I'm in this incredibly privileged state of being my own boss and having a successful company where I could say, I need to take it easy today. I need to literally just take a nap at 9 o'clock in the morning because I'm so tired from this week. But as we've been exploring this idea of burnout with organizations, is how do we think of being proactively resourcing ourselves? And that, I will tell you, we should probably just do a panel discussion on this. I think that has taken me years to truly untangle that tolerance of stress, that belief that hustle means success, and to be more proactive about it. Because even like you said, like the 1 minute of meditation is going to give you a minute of pause, but that's not gonna resolve 20 years of just stress. And it's not going to also prevent whatever stress might be coming your way. So what is that, what are some of those strategies, or even way? Because the other thing I'll say, sorry, let me make this last point. Self-care is often prescribed as something that's reactive and very individually focused, right?
Yeah.
Instead of how do we systemically, how do we as an organization, how do we as a state, how do we as parents of this family, how do we think proactively about resourcing ourselves when we know it's going to be a busy time, when we know we're going into a stressful season? So I'm just curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question, because so much of it is reactionary versus how do we actually prevent that? I mean, I think the answer, there is no right or wrong answer.
Exactly.
But I do think like part of the challenge is, how do we learn to say no? Because we can overprogram ourselves, right? Easily. And we can overschedule ourselves. And so how do you start to, and this might start individually, how do you protect certain things that is going to ensure that you can be the best person that you can be, right? And be the healthiest person that you can be. And I think everything around us makes us say, well, we can't ever say no, right? Because there's these expectations. But in the end, if we don't take care of ourselves, I mean, someone once told me, you're always replaceable, Jami, right? So as hard as I may work and as I want to put it, I think working harder means more success or whatever. In the end, if I should drop over and die tomorrow, they will replace me, right? And so I think we have to sometimes put that perspective, and I'm just as guilty of it By all means. I have been a recovering workaholic for quite some time, and I still have times where I have to work on it more. And sometimes I think the smack in your face is when you start to experience whether they're physical or mental health challenges because you haven't taken that as a priority.
Yeah.
And the hard part is, how do we not get people to that point so that they have this wake up moment? And I think that's the hard part, because it's like, well, it's not going to happen to me, right? That's what happens to other people, not me.
And to the point you made earlier, we don't always realize that the physical challenges we're having are directly the result of the stress we're experiencing, because it's not a visible line to say, no, the reason you're having X challenge is directly tied to the level of stress that you're carrying. Let's talk about the kids, because that, it's been so interesting. I feel we are completely ill prepared for what is coming. And, Nick and I have talked about, there will come a point where there's going to be some diagnosed pandemic, you know what I mean? Diagnosis. And think of the developmental stages. We hear this from people and clients and friends. My kid went to college in the first two or 3 years, and they're like, it changed him, it changed her, it changed them. And their anxiety is higher, the fear is higher, the social anxiety is greater. And then I sit there and I look at, again, I mentioned my young niece and nephew, and boy, that was a tough time to be a parent of littles when you're literally going, I don't think I can pick you up because we don't know anything about this. And all we know is that people are dying from this, right? This disease or this virus. So what is valuable? Like, I guess I just want it to be open. I just want to open it up to, what are you all talking about? Again, what is research? What do you want us to be thinking about? I don't even know where to start, because it's such a big open-ended thing that we're going to have to deal with and are dealing with.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting as we've worked with youth is they have a better understanding and appreciation of what mental health is than I would say the older generations. So even like the work that we've been doing with Make It Okay, it isn't really about reducing stigma necessarily with the younger generation. It's really about creating spaces and understanding of reducing stigma with those adults in their lives.
Sure.
Because that's the comments they say to us is, my parents don't believe me. They don't believe it's real. They don't want me to go to therapy because of the stigma that sits around that. But they openly talk about it amongst their friends and amongst people in their own age group. And so it's been really interesting to just kind of learn about that, I guess, as we've met with youth. But then it also makes a lot of sense. So I think about even my generation, I was never taught anything about mental health. We talked about physical health. I know how to do CPR. I know how to do first aid, right? But we really never talked about the brain, the mental health, like at all. And so I also have an understanding of that's why stigma exists for us.
Yeah. Because
we were never given the tools. We didn't talk about it. It was definitely something that was, behind closed doors, but we have to start talking about it. Our youth are being directly impacted, but so are so many adults who may not even realize it. And it's like, stigma can't be the barrier to entry to help support people so that they can truly live their healthiest life, right? And so we've got to be having conversations at all levels, but we definitely need to be having in that conversation for the older generation to learn to accept that this is real, just like physical health illnesses are real. And how can we really make sure that we're supporting them in the best way? But also, how can we prevent some of the mental health conditions impacting more and more people, right? So when you think about the environment and you think about our food choices, there's so many things that is driving not only physical health, but honestly our mental health. And, I always say our brain is connected to my whole body. It's not separate, right? So we need to be thinking about holistically all the things that are those inputs that are happening, the things that we can control. There are uncontrollables by all means as well. But what are those things that are driving not only physical health challenges that we're dealing with, but also those mental health challenges? We got to support kids now.
Yeah, it will be interesting as more younger people come into the workforce, because that's something I see in the young people in my life as well, is they're talking to each other about stuff that, like you said, we didn't even know existed, right? I just had stomach issues all the time. Well, now we understand that was anxiety, like that we just have this greater understanding. And the other thing is, and even when sometimes we do understand, or have education or information or our own shared experience, right? One of the things we see is that even that doesn't necessarily mean you know how to show up for somebody. That doesn't mean you know how to support somebody. That there are things that we can say or do that can be unintentionally incredibly dismissive, and a lot of folks will resonate, right? Somebody's struggling with anxiety. Not the worst thing, but one of the most ineffective things is to say, don't worry about it. Yeah. And you're like, yeah, that's cute. I know. Thank you for that.
It was so easy.
Is that what I needed to do? Wow. Okay. Like ADHD, just focus. Oh, wow. Really appreciate that. But it's with good intentions, right? And so what are some of those strategies of how we can show up more powerfully for ourselves, right? How do we give ourselves that grace and compassion? What are some of those things that maybe we can even say to ourselves when we're in those heightened mental health challenges? And what does it look like to truly effectively be supportive of someone else?
So I think part of it is listening, right? So we're so good at, I always remind people when we do our Make It Okay presentation, like, we have 2 ears for a reason and 1 mouth, but we often use the one more than the other two, right? And so when I think about when I've been even approached by individuals who are sharing their mental health challenges, or, a lot of it is they're looking for someone to listen to them and not to judge and not to always have the answers. And I think that's the hardest part. I think naturally we want to be able to help people. And I'm definitely one of those, like, how can I help? What can I do? Right. But sometimes it isn't doing anything specifically. It is really just listening and understanding, and maybe asking them, how can I support you? What do you need right now? And it doesn't have to be like, here are all the answers in the world to try and fix it. Because a lot of times you end up saying more hurtful things. Yeah. Even though that's not the intent, right? So it's what I've really learned as I've learned more and reduced my own personal stigma around mental illness, in all honesty, is like, part of it is just stepping back and being someone that they can share with. And I don't have to have all the answers, because they're not necessarily looking for the answers for me anyway. Right. Yeah. So I think that's been my biggest aha through all of this work, as sometimes you just got to zip your lips and listen and see how you can ask them directly how you can support them. And it may just be, thanks for just listening to me. Because I've had that happen many times. It's like, thanks for just understanding and listening and not judging me. That's all I needed right now. Yeah. It's the how do you be the person that people can share the messy, hard stuff with? How do you be the person that somebody knows, I'm in a real vulnerable spot, but I know I can call you and I know you can hear it, and I know you won't judge me and you won't try to fix me. Because that's something we often hear. And we've talked about that on previous episodes of the show, is, managers in particular will say, but I'm not a therapist. Yeah, no. As Erica Reed, one of our trauma-informed specialists that we talked to, she's like, good. Yeah, no, we don't want you to be the therapist. That's not the goal. Exactly. But how do you validate it and normalize it? And even if you don't understand it, to just like, I'm sorry that this is something you're having to navigate. What else, as we think about stepping into this next chapter, if you will, what else do we need to be thinking about for ourselves and for others
knowing that the mental health crisis is going to be a delay or lagging behind, or is going to show up in ways we don't realize always?
I mean, I think when we holistically health in general, I think we've seen some pretty significant impacts from the last couple of years. So, definitely there's a lot of talk about the mental health components, but I think the physical health side of the things as well, we've seen, increases rates around cancer. We've seen increased rates of obesity and diabetes. And so as you think about, again, my whole body, right? It's not just picking out an organ or here and there, that the level of stress, the environment that we're living in, the policies that, drive our choices each and every day really do have an impact on the overall health of each and every one of us. And we may not see it tomorrow. And I think that's the hardest part sometimes working in this space, is the things that we are even trying to do. So even as we're talking about reducing stigma around mental illness, the impact might not be, or the outcomes might not be there tomorrow or the next year, right? Sometimes it takes a generation to shift. And that's really hard for our society to put our heads around, because we're very much like, well, it should have happened yesterday type of thing, right? It's not, we aren't ready. And this is why the work of prevention is so hard, is because we expect it to be fixed yesterday or not in 10 years from now. So even when I think about our childhood obesity challenges that we talked about, the things we do today will have an impact, yes, potentially tomorrow at a small level, but really those impacts are long-term, right? They're generational shifting, and that is really hard for us to think about. So as we even think in the workplace, it's not just about tomorrow, it's about what does this even look like as we think about our youth today, and they're entering into the workforce in the next, every year they are, but if we take this generation, what are the impacts of that going to be? These children are going to enter the workforce with very different health challenges than when you and I entered the workforce, right? And so how are businesses even preparing for what's to come when it comes to, we see higher rates of mental health diagnosis, we see higher rates of diabetes and obesity in the generation that's entering the workforce today than we've ever seen before. And so when you think about your whole population, a lot of times it's, if you want to get into the money part of it even, right, is the younger generation tended to be healthier. So they were helping support the older generations that naturally you have more chronic health conditions and disease. Right. But we're not going to have that healthy generation per se to help kind of float and even out the amount of funds needed for health insurance, for example. It's going to look very different, but I don't think we're thinking about those things.
No.
Why aren't we talking about that today? And that's why it's so important that we are doing things for our youth today, because they are our future workforce. They will be the ones caring for us. And I really hope that we can set them up for better success than we have in the last generation, so that they can enter the workforce and be productive in society and not have health being a major challenge and barrier for them to be productive.
Yeah. And even just understanding that fundamental difference is going to be challenging for a lot of folks, because you already hear it, right? People don't want to work as much. They're not as, right? They're not as tough. They're not as, and not taking into consideration that there are some differences. It's not some individual selfish choice by that person. It is the system, it's the container in which they were grown in, essentially. And, I get it, right? Companies are looking at what's our survival this year? What's our, and something that's been a shift for me in my own health journey over the last year is, what can I start doing today so that 60-year-old Sarah will appreciate, right? How do I start being aware of, well, my muscle loss is going to start increasing, and how do I do some strength training? How do I start taking more calcium supplements? Makes me feel so old saying it, but the reality is and it's interesting to think about, especially those organizations that are legacy organizations. What are the things you can put in place now that will support not only your workforce now, but set your workforce 10, 15 years from now up for success? I think that's a really provocative push. Jami, it's always such a pleasure to talk with you. And I'm so excited we made this happen. And And we will absolutely make sure that we connect to all of your great resources. On a personal level, Jami, since this is the first time you're on the show, I have to ask the question we ask all first-time guests, and that is, what was a conversation you had with yourself or with someone else that was particularly transformative for you?
So I've thought a lot about this question, right? Like, where do I even go? I think one of them that shifted my focus in my early 20s when I was at a high burnout even was the conversation that you are replaceable.
Yeah.
And really reflecting, and I haven't perfected this by any means because I have some perfectionism issues myself and workaholic issues, right? But that is true. We are all replaceable. We will all die someday. Mm-hmm. And so as you think about, and especially into my 20s was really about, I got to work because that defines success, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of wish I even thinking about myself at that time, I wish someone would have smacked me upside the head sooner and said, that isn't everything, right?
Yeah.
Do you want on your gravestone, oh, she worked herself to death?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, so I think really it's made me think about what do I want my legacy to be? And is it, yes, the work I do every single day. And I'm super passionate about this. So I feel so fortunate to work in something that I have such purpose and passion around personally as well as professionally. And not everyone gets that opportunity. So I feel so lucky and privileged that I'm in this position. But I also remind myself that, life is short, it's precious, and it can't be everything that I am. It has to be much more than that.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Jami. For people who are interested in connecting with you, either to learn more about the work that you're doing with the Healthiest State Initiative or looking for resources or just wanting to connect with you on a personal level, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, so we're on every social media platform for Iowa Healthiest State Initiative. So you can definitely check those out. And most of them are just Iowa Healthiest State as our kind of our handle. If you want to find me personally, I'm on LinkedIn and it's Jami Haberl. So pretty easy to find as long as you can spell it right.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes. Make it real easy for folks. Jami, thank you so much for the work you're doing and for being willing to come on the show and share all of your beautiful insights. I appreciate you so much.
Well, thanks so much. I remember the first time I met you. And you spoke at our conference many moons ago. So I appreciate all the work you're doing to bring awareness to all of these topics that are so important.
It's taken a community, right? To support the community. So thank you again. For sure. Our guest this week has been Jami Haberl. And as always, I leave thinking things, feeling things, and chewing on how to do things differently. And this particular conversation, I'm really struck by the fact that there hasn't been sort of this collective or intentional reflection on what the hell did we all just experience over the last couple of years? So that's something I want to take on for myself. And as always, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what resonated for you, what came up for you, what questions came up for you. And if you want to share your COVID story, you can share that with us at podcast@sarahnollwilson.com, where I read and respond to every message we receive. And if you like the show, there's a couple of ways you can support us. If you haven't already, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform. This helps us increase visibility so we can continue to have great discussions like the ones we did with Jami Haberl. Also, consider becoming a patron, where your financial support will go to support the team that makes this show possible, and you'll get some pretty great swag, and you will also get episodes early and ad-free. You can do that by going to patreon.com/conversations on conversations. And a big thank you to the team that makes this show possible, to our producer, Nick Wilson, our sound editor, Drew Knoll, our transcriptionist, Becky Reinert, our marketing consultant, Jessica Burge, and the rest of the Snowco crew. And a big final thank you to Jami Haberl and the work that she is doing. Well, my friends, that concludes this week's episode of Conversations on Conversations. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, when we can change the conversations we have with ourselves and others, we can change the world. So till next week, please be sure to rest, rehydrate, and we'll see you again soon.